the Mahabharata. This is from the Vedic tradition of India. And they're talking about the end of the Yuga, the end of our current world age. And after going through this long litany of disasters, they say these all will take place at the end of the Yuga. And when men become fierce and destitute of virtue, then does the Yuga come to the end. And the course of the winds will be confused and agitated, and innumerable meteors. Notice this, innumerable meteors. So they're getting pretty explicit here. They're getting pretty darn close to what I think constitutes the solution of this problem. Innumerable meteors will flash through the sky, foreboding evil. And then the sun will appear with 6 others of the same kind, and all around will be din and uproar, and everywhere there will be conflagrations, and fires will blaze up on all sides when the end of the Yuga comes. What do you think this image of the sun with 6 others? How might we explain that by naturalistic phenomena? See, up until this day and age, the tendency has been for all of those of a scientific bent to basically consider all of this as, either allegorical or, superstitious belief in supernatural events. But it's only within the last decade or two, I think, that science has begun to sort of begrudgingly say, well, maybe some of this stuff from these ancient traditions isn't just something conjured up in the illiterate fantasies of a bunch of savages who have to have some way of explaining what they don't understand. Maybe, in fact, what we're seeing here is traditions, maybe, yes, garbled or modified through successive tellings, but traditions that go back and have roots in real events. And maybe these traditions can actually give us insight into these real events. And I think that when we start adopting that position and realize that ancient peoples were a lot more educated and sophisticated than previously believed, and that many of these myths, although they sound quaint and they're loaded with imagery, bizarre imagery and so forth, once we begin to have the linguistic key for deciphering them, once we have the Rosetta Stone, so to speak, we can begin to read these myths as recollections of actual events. This is, we go from the Old Testament, Sodom and Gomorrah, to the New Testament, Book of Revelation. How many of you actually read the Book of Revelation? It's worth doing.
It's just like I had no frame of reference for all the symbolism.
Well, see, hopefully now you'll be getting a frame of reference. I think the Book of Revelation is basically a description of not the supernatural, but supernature. A little bit different, supernature going on. The cosmic nature that our ancestors experienced firsthand and attempted to preserve through whatever means. In this case, symbolism. What is the censer? You know, right? What's a censer? It's what they carry, the priest carries the incense in, right? Right? See, so they're using analogies from, but in this case we have an angel taking the censer and fills it with fire of the altar and casts it into the earth. Now, when we go and we begin to read some of the modern analogs, what I refer to as the cosmic lessons, such as the Tunguska event of 1908, or what we were talking about last lecture, the Chicago fire and the Peshtigo fire, as you begin to read these accounts, and then you set them line by line against the ancient accounts, the parallels are so striking that it's mind-boggling. The second angel, see, they're talking about the unleashing of the 7 seals here. The second angel sounded, and as it were, a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea. Well, this is pretty literal, isn't it? How many times have asteroids or large meteors or comets or their byproducts fallen into Earth's oceans? More times than we can count. We don't even know how many times. We're up to 200 now identified craters and astroblems on Earth's land surface. This is only the limited part of the surface that we've been able to survey. We don't know what's under the Greenland ice cap. We've discovered that through subglacial surveys, they've now found evidence that there's a huge crater under the Antarctic ice cap. But in any case, remember, Earth's land surface area is what, a quarter of the surface of the globe? So how many does that mean have actually fallen into the ocean? And how many have fallen into the ocean since humans have been around? It's probably happened quite a few times, more times than people realize. So what is this saying? I mean, what if we just took this at face value? A great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea, and the third part of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died. Now, you know, this is kind of interesting because if you read the accounts of the great impact event that produced the Chesapeake Bay crater about 35 million years ago, they're estimating that roughly a third to half of the creatures in the sea died as a result of that impact. And this was the impact that sprayed out the molten material all over the state of Georgia that formed the Georgia tektite field. So you can go down to the areas down near Macon where the Eocene-Oligocene boundary is exposed to the surface, and that's where all of the Georgia tektites have been found. If you haven't done so, go over to Fernbank Science Center. They have a really nice display of Georgia tektites. And Georgia tektites, again, when you're looking at those, these really elegant aerodynamic shapes, what that was you had basically a mountain, burning mountain, falling out of the sky, I mean, it was shooting out of the sky at probably 20,000 miles an hour, crashed in and formed what is now Chesapeake Bay. At the bottom of Chesapeake Bay is a hole 50 miles wide that's filled with sediment. When that thing hit, everything sprayed out, and a huge amount of that spray just came down over Georgia, forming what is now known as the Georgia tektite field. Now, it doesn't get more explicit than this, does it? And the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, and it fell upon the third part of the rivers and upon the fountains of the water. And the name of the star is Wormwood. And the third part of the waters became wormwood, and many men died of the waters because they were made bitter. Well, interestingly, you know, in a great impact, you're going to have all kinds of things like sulfur dioxide and things that would be injected into the atmosphere. If you had an impact where there was a limestone bedrock, it would inject huge amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And all of this stuff that's being injected into the atmosphere is going to precipitate back out in the form of very intense acid rain. And so when we look at this in terms of the context of what we now know about modern science, all of this is very consistent with what we now know. And see, if we look at this, the second angel sounds, and there's a great burning mountain falls into the sea, causing havoc to marine life. The third angel sounds, and there's a great star falling from heaven, and it falls upon the land, as it says, destroying the rivers and upon the fountains of water. Because certainly what would happen in the case of a great impact is it would open up the bedrock enough to expose the water, the subterranean waters, and probably cause the water table to become poisoned. The fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star fall from heaven unto the earth, and to him was given the key of the bottomless pit. And he opened the bottomless pit, and there arose a smoke out of the pit, and as the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit. Once again, we have a very accurate and explicit explanation. You know, something comes and strikes the earth, you know, especially if it's a dense object like one of the iron asteroids striking Earth, it's going to gouge an extremely deep hole. It's going to create a deep pit, in effect. The stuff that is excavated out in the creation of the pit is going to go into the atmosphere. It's going to reduce the optical luminosity of the atmosphere, and if you're close enough to the impact, actually it would turn day into night, literally. And so what we see here is when we place these prophecies like this in the context of what we now know, these aren't some, you know, raving delusions. These are actually very accurate descriptions of events that could happen and certainly have happened. Question is, did these events happen, you know, within the perception of ancient man? And I think clearly the existence of these kinds of traditions from all over the world implies that it did happen. From the New Testament, the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens shall pass away with a great noise, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. The earth also and the works that are therein shall be burnt up. Now, what's interesting, if you remember from last discussion 2 weeks ago about some of the descriptions of how literally metal buildings, like in the Chicago fire, literally melted down in 5 minutes. You know, huge, cast iron frameworks, metal buildings, within 5 minutes had melted down under the fierceness of this fire. And here we have the Hopi Indians discussing this is their origin myths, talking about that the people went down to live with the ant people. And when they were all safe and settled, Teawa commanded Sotuknung to destroy the world. He rained fire upon it. Fire came from above and below and all around until the earth, the waters, the air, all was one element fire, and there was nothing left except the people safe inside the womb of the earth. Now, one of the things is we'll see as we go on here in the descriptions of some of these great 19th century fires, as people were describing that literally the air itself was on fire. It wasn't like anything they'd ever seen before. It wasn't like the buildings were burning and the trees were burning. The air was burning. And then the burning air consumed everything. But that's why when they begin to see this, like when the first fire came to Peshtigo, it didn't come through the woods, it came out of the sky. And that's what the people described, that it rained fire. And so the tops of the trees caught first. The tops of the houses and the barns were the first thing to catch. Here's an example of the South American tribes, Daniel G. Brinton, Myths of the New World. Very interesting book if you ever get a chance to read it. I think it's been reissued several times. He's talking about the South American tribes, right, in their mythology. He says the greater number represent the last destruction of the world to have been by water. A few of them, however, the Takalis of the North Pacific coast, the Yuracaris of the Bolivian Cordillera, and the Mbacobi of Paraguay, attributed to a general conflagration which swept over the whole earth, consuming every living thing except a few who took refuge in a deep cave. Now here you're looking at Brazilian tribes that are down in Paraguay, having the same story essentially as the Hopi Indians, taking refuge from these tremendous fires by going into caves. Now, is this something that they just independently kind of made up? Or is there really an event back there in the prehistory of the human species where humans did survive some kind of cosmic conflagration by taking refuge in a cave?
Is there a time somewhere in here? Somewhere 10, 11,000 years ago?
Well, my guess is that what'll happen is you've got these great events, like going back to the big floods. Okay, what'll happen if those big floods at the end of the Ice Age, we know now were 11, 12, 13,000 years ago. Okay, it gets embedded into the collective memory, becomes part of the collective consciousness, becomes part of the great oral tradition that's passed down. Okay, now, subsequent to that, another event comes along whose magnitude and severity is not as great. However, people still interpret it within that same framework. Just like as you will see when we read about, remember 2 weeks ago when we were looking at the Chicago stuff and the Peshtigo stuff, how many people experience this and then begin to interpret it within their framework of Judgment Day, their understanding of Judgment Day. Over and over and over again, we saw in the accounts the people were saying, they were thinking it was the end of the world. This is it. Okay, and so they're interpreting it within their reference frame. Okay, so I think that what we've got here is that you have a great event. It becomes part of the collective consciousness, and just like when Leonard Woolley was excavating in Sumeria, and he found a flood layer that was 5,000 years old, and thought that he had found the evidence for Noah's flood, right? Well, subsequent investigation showed that it was a devastating flood, but it was only a regional flood. It was certainly nothing that could be interpreted as a global flood, okay? However, in the minds of the Sumerians and the Akkadians, and after them the Babylonians who lived there, it's very possible that in the myths, the elements of one get juxtaposed with the earlier ones, and so it becomes a matter of trying to differentiate. I think that in some of these cases we may actually be seeing layers of myth, you know, that ultimately behind it there was like a great world destroying flood, okay? But then thousands of years later there's a lesser flood, that gets remembered and passed down, and at some point after who knows how many generations, the two events sort of become intermingled. If you read carefully the accounts of Noah's flood, you'll see that it's actually, that's a very classic case of the intermingling of two different flood accounts. If you read the biblical accounts in the book of Genesis, that's a good exercise. If you read that, and with that in mind, you'll become aware, you will go, oh yes, clearly it's describing two different events here that have become intermingled. In one case we've got the Elohim, in the other case we've got Yahweh. In one case we've got animals being conducted into the ark 2 by 2, in the other case by 7s. In some cases you have Noah entering the ark and the floods coming on the same day. In another case, Noah enters the ark and the floods come a week later. So if you carefully read the accounts, you'll see that there actually are two separate stories that have become intermingled. Generally interpreted as just variations on one account, but I'm actually thinking that the possibility is that you have a layering of events, possibly an earlier event followed by a subsequent event, and then as time passes, those two events sort of become mingled together and indistinguishable. Just a couple of things we talked about. This is where I gathered this material together about a series of great fires that happened in North America in the 19th century. The last one was in the year 1910. Okay, but these fires all have something in common, and that is the intensity, the ferocity, the rapidity with which they came on, the sheer magnitude of these fires, which puts them almost or clearly in a category by themselves. And the first one that I have found in the literature, going back in the record of North American fires, was this Miramichi fire of 1825. Now, how many of you from 2 weeks ago remember the date of this particular fire?
October 10th.
Not quite.
9th.
This one was October 7th. You were close. You're only a couple of days off.
Well, there was one on the 7th and one on the 9th.
Okay, the first one, notice these were the important points that I wanted to get you to remember last week. We see that there was on the 7th, and the first thing that indication that something was up was this sickly mist, as they describe it, tinged with purple. Now this is very typical of the descriptions associated with some of these fires. Notice the time, I have it underlined, around 9 o'clock, and it's on October 7th of 1825.
Purple connect to ethylene, methane, or that other acetyl da-da-da-da gas?
Perhaps, and I haven't done enough in-depth study yet, but however, when it, under these circumstances, we don't know, because essentially we're seeing uncharted territory here.
I want to ask you another question. How long do these fires last as compared to what we've got going out in the west now? I mean, the fires seem to last forever.
Well, in this case, if you read the literature, what you find out is that, like this summer here of 1825, it was a dry summer. There were a lot of fires going on in the woods, clearing fires. Native Americans burned off a lot of land. It was a regular thing that they would do. Hunters would leave fires unattended. And the people who lived in these pristine woods were used to fire. They knew fire. And so in some cases there had been fires burning, low-grade fires burning for weeks. But what happened on these particular dates is that something suddenly happened, that was qualitatively different than everything that had come before it, which led a lot of the survivors to make declarations such as this. Said one unnamed poet who went through it, all it required to complete a picture of the general judgment was the blast of a trumpet, the voice of the archangel, and the resurrection of the dead. This is the kind of reference that we see repeatedly over and over again in these accounts of these survivors.
But that doesn't tell me how long they burned.
Oh, typically they would burn through. I mean, in the case of the Peshtigo fire, it basically burned up the peninsula and was pretty much gone within 24 hours. Within 24 hours.
But it burned all night, and it would have had to burn the trees up.
Well, yeah, as you'll see here, I mean, basically the fire stopped when it consumed every single thing there was to consume, even to the roots 20 and 30 feet going into the ground.
This is awesome. So this thing going out in Southern California is really nothing compared to this.
Correct. Right. See, with these, like here we find, we're still talking about this fire of 1825. We see, like here, spouts. What did you say, Bill? The analogy you used? Now see, this is what I thought of when you said that. Spouts of fire rained down on treetops.
That's what I remember I was saying last week. The thing that makes sense to me is it's like it was chunks of ice, and they would be outgassing methane or acetylene. Air. Oxygen gets to them.
See, again, like it says here, many people being fairly convinced that the end of the world had come, threw themselves on their knees and began to pray for deliverance on the day of judgment. There was a lot of people that died in these fires simply because they took no measures to save themselves, since they truly believed the end of the world had come. Now, again, these are people who have seen forest fires, who fought forest fires. You know, some of these were seasoned woodsmen, people who had lived in the forest all their lives, who are seeing this and experiencing this thing and assuming it's the end of the world.
Any description of the color of the fire?
Well, if you let me go here, you'll see. One of the things we see is that everything got real quiet. They could hear a subtle roar booming in the distance, getting closer and closer. Then everything gets very quiet. This is then followed, as it says here, then the wind blew a hurricane and the roaring noise became tremendous. Flames burst in masses from darkness, and then the whole sky was illuminated by an immense sheet of fire that in a moment enveloped Newcastle and Douglastown. So within 3 minutes from the first appearance of flames, most of the houses in that area were on fire. And this is consistent with these series of fires, is that, again, like they say, the whole sky was illuminated by a sheet of flame. And in a matter of minutes, it had just consumed 2 entire towns. Everyone who saw it shouted or screamed. It seemed as if the whole town cried out at once. Dogs barked and howled, horses snorted and galloped, cattle lowed and bawled in as great a terror as the people. Some shouted, "It's the judgment day, the world's on fire, the judgment day has come." Many cried and some fell on their knees praying aloud. So frightened that I knew not what to do, I stood staring at the flames that darted up far up into the sky behind the hill. All of these are from accounts that I've collected over the years. The description, like this one here, is interesting. At Chatham, this is one of the towns that got consumed, the appearance of the heavens was awful, representing as far as the eye was capable of extending one unvariable body of flames. So this is not like people looking around and seeing the trees in the forest burning up. They're seeing the sky on fire. And that's why they're thinking the end of the world has come. They've seen, well, we've seen forest fires before. You know, we've seen fires coming through the trees and burning up the trees, but this is different. Because here the sky is on fire. And notice again the time here, 9 o'clock, about 9 o'clock. See, the harmony of creation appeared to have been deranged and about to revert into original chaos. And here, like see, for a moment, and all was still. A deep and awful silence reigned over everything. All nature appeared to be hushed into dumbness when suddenly a lengthened and sullen roar came booming through the forest and driving 1,000 massive and devouring flames before it. So here we have this, in every description you find this lull, you know, and then before the final onslaught. Yeah, here, this is, so the New Brunswick fires here that we're talking about covered some 2 million acres of timber. Killed huge amounts of fish and game, just destroyed unbelievable amounts of timber that just were completely lost in these conflagrations. I have myself heard old men report that their fathers had seen the toll of game and that it had been terrible. More game, it was said, was killed by the Miramichi and other fires in 1825 than had previously been killed since white men came. But this is a way of trying to make something specific out of the tales that have been handed down of carcasses of deer and moose and bear so thick that one could hardly walk between them. The Miramichi fire still stands as the great forest conflagration of the northeastern Atlantic seaboard and the greatest forest fire in the history of Canada. And then we've already covered the Chicago fire. Now notice something here. Notice the time, 9 o'clock Sunday night. The date of this fire, what was the date of the Chicago fire? October 8th. So only one day different than the Miramichi fire, and also it breaks out at 9 o'clock, the same time. The same time that the firestorm came upon this New Brunswick and essentially devoured half of New Brunswick. 46 years later, only one day difference, same time at night, this all-devouring fire comes upon Chicago and essentially destroys Chicago. Let's see. Yes, everyone has read, if he did not himself pass through the horrible experience, how the very air itself seemed full of fire, how the flames seemed to take giant leaps of many hundreds of yards, breaking out in points far away from the scenes of general disaster, and how huge balloons, now this is interesting, balloons of flames swept through the sky to descend and break like a burning water spout, licking up every vestige of human life and labor from open clearings to which many had fled as to a haven of safety. This is another thing that happened with these fires, is that, people who lived in the forests, who lived in the towns, knew that if the fires were coming in, they would take refuge by getting away from combustible substances. In the villages, in the communities in the forest, they had fire breaks around the villages. Fires, if great fires broke out, farmers or people would gather in the open fields, again, to get away from the combustible material. With these fires, that didn't work. Because with these fires, the fire essentially swept everything. Again, it seemed to have was indifferent to what was combustible or not on the ground. It says, in the process, devastating flames were kindled afresh in hundreds of places so far removed from the previous locality that it seemed as if the havoc could only have been wrought by the torch of a descending angel. Now, destroying angel, sorry. So this picture of a torch is interesting, and you'll see why in a few minutes. But I put in here the tarot card, which you guys saw last week, which essentially shows the great angel, as described in the book of Revelations, who has one hand, 1 foot on land and 1 foot in the water, and with one hand pours out the waters of the deluge, and in the other has the torch in his hand of the fire descending towards the earth. This is an occult tradition that I think perhaps sheds some light upon these events. It says here, there is nothing wherewith the fire can be compared. Now this is still the Chicago fire. It stands alone, a monument in the annals of pyrology. But when the reader looks intelligently at the enormous surface burned over, remembers the very brief time occupied in the destruction, and then reads the particular narrative or recital, he may arrive at some little comprehension of the catastrophe. Another factor, the incredible rapidity of the flames. This was something that was typical, again, was how fast the fires came in and consumed everything. Just selection of quotes. During all this time, the fire was falling torrents. There was literally a rain of fire. Again, I saw the sky, as it were, in flames over my head. What a scene, a sea of fire. Finally, here indeed commenced the total extermination of all that was combustible. Buildings of every description were swept away, leaving the ground upon which they had stood a field of absolute waste. Now here's somebody comparing the heat, as they say, could only be compared to that from the combustion of oxygen and hydrogen. Some of the freaks of the fire are scarcely credible. Very reliable gentlemen reported that they saw jets of flame dart across an entire block and in an instant envelop the building it struck in a winding sheet of lurid flame. We saw this last week, so I don't want to spend too much time here. I want to just get on with it. These are just some artist scenes done in the aftermath of the fire to try to, depict some of the havoc and the panic that was going on in the streets as people were trying to save themselves. Here they're talking about the interior of buildings. The fervor was unprecedented, as witnessed the melting of the great courthouse bell, the burning of many safes. So here, like, the temperature was above 3,000 degrees. And again, this kind of evidence here points to the conclusion that this was not an ordinary fire. Wood fires don't burn this hot. They don't burn so hot that they just consume metal and cause stone to just blister and break apart.
We had a meteor hit the two towers.
A fierce seesawing hurricane set in. The fire appeared to tear up and instantly consume the firmer structures, while light and loose articles were hurled into the air like blazing torches. Now this is interesting. Notice this, Bill. A large mass of fire, seemingly 2 feet in length and 1 foot in thickness, arose from a spot just north of Taylor Street and went whirling through the air for more than 3 blocks, alighting on the cupola of the German Catholic Church. The entire building was almost instantly enveloped in flame. So what is that?
That's some kind of a jet.
Well, yeah.
Incredible.
This shows some of the devastation. You guys saw this last week. Okay, so you've seen some of this. All right. Okay, well, then I put this in here because I thought by comparison this is kind of interesting. This is Hiroshima, Chicago, 1871.
1941?
What about August 3rd? 6th, yeah.
6th and the 15th.
15th was Nagasaki, right.
6th and 15th.
But by comparison, I mean, if we look for a modern analog, I mean, this is like, to me, the closest thing we can find. Okay, so what was the date of the Chicago fire?
October 8th. October 8th.
October 8th, 1871. The greatest forest fire in American history, the Peshtigo fire. When was it? Can you read that? Now, just purely by coincidence, the greatest urban conflagration in the history of America occurred on the same day as the greatest forest fire in the history of America. And further, they both started at the same time. October 8th, 1971 marks the centennial of the 2 greatest natural catastrophes in the history of the Middle West. Ironically, both happened not only on the same day, but almost at the same hour. Both had been preceded by ample but disregarded omens.